Welcome back to Decouple. Today, I'm joined by returning guest, Dr. Simon Michaux, who came on recently, just back in December, did a wonderful self-introduction, but briefly is a geometallurgist, a word that my spell check does not recognize, but that Simon did explain a little bit in our last episode. As well, I think, our only explosives expert to ever come on the podcast. So, Simon, welcome back. It's great having you back again. Thanks for making the time.
G'day, Chris. It's really nice to see you again. So let's have some of those questions.
For sure. And, just for the folks watching on YouTube, you might see my eyes have dried up. They were looking a little teary, trying to stop the incessant blinking that some people comment on. Simon did tell me a great dad joke relevant to mining, which we'll get to, I think, maybe as a little halftime break. But we have a lot of stuff to discuss. And the reason, Simon, I brought you back is because your paper has definitely generated some pushback. Again, that paper is the assessment of extra capacity required of alternative energy electric power systems to completely replace fossil fuels. We'll run through what the findings of that study are briefly, but to sum it all up, my read is that we're a little hooped in terms of the mineral requirements for a net zero future. It's generated a lot of pushback, I think, because this poses a very real obstacle to something a lot of folks are invested in. So there are some alternative studies that have come out. I want to talk a little bit about modeling variables and why your study is potentially finding different things than other studies that are out there. So yeah, why don't we just jump on in? In our last episode, you did go through some of the findings of your study, so we'll keep it brief on that. And then, let's jump into the pushback and a bit of a critique of modeling.
So work done was due to the need that when I arrived from the Australian mining industry to Europe, and I was sitting in European Commission meetings listening to the circular economy and H2020 plans for the future about how they were going to phase out fossil fuels. This was in 2017. And it was amazingly clear to me was the people making these plans had these massive blind spots. There were a whole lot of things that they just didn't seem to understand. And it came down to, in Europe, we don't do mining. We buy stuff off the market. Even the manufacturing that's done in Europe is based on components that are made elsewhere, usually China or South Korea. And so I've been giving some thought about how to communicate what I've been seeing to these people in a way where they can't refute it. And I used to be one of these guys that used to write these models and papers, and that was describing things like energy intensity and what have you. And I found that didn't work. Like when I couldn't get anywhere with that because it was, and so when I actually went the engineering calculation route, that's when I started getting some action happening. So the outcome is, if we were to knock out fossil fuels, and that is all electrical power generation, oil, gas, and coal, that's, we take all that out and then we replace it with non-fossil fuel systems, and we're allowed to use any non-fossil fuel system, including nuclear, hydro, solar, geothermal, wind, et cetera. And the entire transport fleet has to be, that is dependent on petroleum products in some form, has got to be stood down and replaced with something else. And it's a combination of vehicles that are electric vehicles and hydrogen fuel cells. So the calculation was, what were our industrial actions at the time? And if we were to go completely electric, take petroleum out, what extra power would we need? And so this set off a chain reaction. And so, and what would each power system need? The outcome was a really large number of a large amount of electrical power, much larger than our existing system. Like to give you the actual numbers, in 2018, the global system consumed 26,614 terawatt hours of electricity. So this is electrical stuff, not petrol and petroleum and ICE generation. It's just our electrical generation, where a big chunk of that was fossil fuel. And to phase that out, we've got to phase out the fossil fuels and to build the extra capacity to charge the batteries and make the hydrogen. Right, we need an extra 37,289.7 terawatt hours on top of our non-fossil fuel system at the moment. Those numbers have shifted a little bit because through a period of review, I've had about 30 people review this now. And each time there is the numbers are shifting, and they finally stabilized. And a couple of days ago, all of this has been pushed into a peer-reviewed journal, full calculation, both studies, from one end to the other. And so a lot of the criticisms on Twitter can now go away because it's now a peer-reviewed study. It's passed through the first generation of peer review, 5-6 people, and the second generation, which I think is one person, is in progress now.
Are these peer reviewers, mostly from academia, or are there any kind of from the real world of engineering, mining?
So because of the nature of what I'm suggesting, normally when we do a peer review, we only need 1 or 2 reviewers, and we pull it from the field. But because this is like a meta science, it bridges everything. The first big report, if you look in the front, there's actually a panel of 25 people. I said, thank you. That's the review panel, right? Because you've got each section that looked at needed a reviewer from that section. So I needed someone from nuclear to review it. I needed someone from hydrogen to review it. I needed someone from minerals to review things. Multiple electrical engineers. I needed someone from who actually runs wind power generation systems. There's a corporation in Finland called Fortum that owns and runs wind turbines, right? And so you had to go through these hoops, and it was quite a long and arduous process because of the nature of the study, right? And so that was the first generation of work, and now the second generation's come, and I've presented it many times. It's been reviewed back and forth. The monkeys on Twitter throwing poo were actually useful in determining what needed to go into the final peer review paper, and so okay, so the outcome is we need 37,289 terawatt hours of extra capacity over on top of what we have now. And so the system will expand in size, so it's 175%. Now, those numbers are conservative. They're on the small side.
Because usually you hear about sort of need to double or triple the grid for an electrify everything agenda.
Yeah, so I'm not including manufacture, for example.
Really?
Like steel manufacture is in there. But when you make a solar panel, you've got like your silicon wafer, you've got to heat that silicon to 2,200 degrees Celsius. At the moment, we use coke and coal to do that. Take away coke and coal, you've got to do something else. And there are alternatives, but they haven't been costed and calculated up because they didn't have enough of the data to be
Is
stable.
that like electric arc furnaces? Is that the only real replacement for those kind of process temperature heats?
No, you can use biofuels. So electric arc, biofuels, or hydrogen. So like a nuclear power plant has got an internal temperature of about 500-600 degrees, right? So that's not going to help us, and so see all of these things work, and you can do it on a small scale, but you try and scale the buggers up. That's when the trouble starts.
And I think that's the problem with so much of the popular media coverage. Our sense of what's possible comes from these again sort of breathless media articles, and one has to think when you really assess, how starving a lot of journalists are, that there's a certain amount of, and even the sort of publications. I mean, obviously they're a bit starved as well. We're seeing a real crisis in media, but the sort of advertorial nature of some of the writing around these pilot projects again really does leave out these considerations of scalability. And I mean, perhaps that's just a limitation of the folks writing these stories, and scalability is a hard concept to grasp without a overall knowledge of supply chains and heavy industry. Is that kind of your read?
So you've got those issues, but as well as you've got a series of ideologies which are forming to be effectively echo chambers, because we haven't actually done this yet, and so we're only talking about it still. The amount of renewable power that we brought online is impressive, but it's nowhere near what we need to do when we get serious, right? And so we haven't actually crossed the threshold yet of actually sort of doing this properly. And there's a number of things here.
So just briefly, the hydrogen to run, steel plants, for instance, is that requirement for hydrogen generation factored into your study? Because 170% expansion actually doesn't, I mean, just from a Gestalt perspective, doesn't seem enough to run those processes as well. Does it include the hydrogen production?
No, no, it doesn't. I've assumed all coal-fired steel production goes to electric arc furnace. About 30% of the coal industry is there already. So the hydrogen to make steel, when this study came out, there weren't numbers publicly available where I could actually use them to the point where I could do calculations like this. So I referenced the hybrid project, which is what we got here in Sweden. And but I said, moving forward. So this whole study was to make a point. Now, and the point was that the people who control our world now, and I'm talking about the banking sector, what do they think? And they still talk in the terms of economic growth. Like 2% growth. Help us do 2% growth or don't bother coming. I heard them say that, right? And the other one was, I was a presenter in the C20 that actually advises the G20 one year. And the G20 rep came and said to us, look, if you can't help us do 2% growth, don't bother handing anything in. And they said, but hang on, this is the civil service side of things. And I said, well, civil society. So, okay, that's it, right? That's it. We will not accept anything from the C20 in our deliberations. So the whole C20 conference was a PR exercise that we lived in a civil society. And that was really quite a, right, okay. So the banking sector believes that we are still on the growth machine, and they are still funding and operating the internal combustion engine society, right? And their attitude is, I'm not going to do anything until you can show me how to make money off you, or how you can show me how to destroy a competitor. I actually heard them say that too in a banking meeting, right? And this is why nothing's changed. So there's a lot of talk. So the guys that actually think the future is either going to be the same as it was for the last 50 years, or we're going to fall back on this thing called the green transition, and it's all sorted. And their attitude is, you go and sort it out. Whoever goes in first will make the market take all the risk, and then we'll step in and take the markets from them. That's their attitude. And what that means is nothing actually happens. So for the last 15 years, we've been talking in platitudes that have been largely the same since 2008. Things haven't really changed.
And so far, in terms of where the money's coming from for the limited, so-called energy transition that we've had so far, therefore is not coming so much from the banking sector, but more from government subsidy, or?
Government subsidy's been driving it, but the banking sector have been supporting it. But they're sort of doing about, well, we'll step in when there's a real market.
And I would gather sort of supporting it in order to harvest subsidy as well.
Yes, that's right. And everything's about money, and the banking sector is very predatory. Predation is their basic means of operation. And so they have been supporting it, but we haven't really, it's all been, the stuff that's been able to get up has been forced to be the only stuff that is economically viable when they're in competition with fossil fuels in terms of cost. And so they've been driving the costs down. And a lot of the studies that are saying about the green transition look at market cost. And they're finally getting their act together to actually be in a position where that cost can be driven down. And they're predicting that the renewable energy technology would become cheaper than fossil fuels. But before we get there, we've got supply blockages. And so my work was to talk to those guys. And once you understand that their plan is not going to work, the whole thing gets put to one side and we move on to what do we do instead. And there are options on the table for that.
Your reason for saying that this option won't work is there simply aren't enough minerals to make it happen. For the first generation.
First of all, the scale of the problem is so large that we've completely unprepared for what we're looking at. We don't have the time to manufacture so many things so quickly. Like we've in Europe committed to like 32% non-fossil fuel by 2030. That's 7 years away, guys.
And this isn't just electricity. This is all energy. Is that correct?
Correct. And Finland has actually committed to renewable targets to be carbon neutral by 2035
for the whole country.
For the whole country. So the sheer size of this is huge. They committed to things without doing the math on what's involved. And I'm getting calls from the groups like the Helsinki Urbanization Commission and they said, look, we've got a problem here because now that we've committed to this, the people we're asking to do things on our behalf just won't. They just said this is not possible. Leave us alone. And so they've starting to see that they're in a bind now that they're starting to do it.
What do you see, just as another tangent here? I mean, what do you see? What do you foresee happening as these commitments that politicians are making, just don't come true? What impact does that have on public opinion? Like, there's perhaps a lack of skepticism now of the targets that are being set. But what do you think happens when they actually don't come true, or when, for instance, electric vehicle mandates, result in a fleet of electric vehicles that simply can't be charged reliably?
So that's something I've been giving you a bit of thought of, and the answers aren't very nice, right? Now, because what I thought we were about one political cycle away from the great unwash, the voting public, realizing that all these promises that have been made for their future by their democratically elected leaders were never going to happen because they haven't done any work.
Or made any sacrifice.
The number of the number of power stations they think they're going to bring online is enormous. They're bringing on some, but nowhere near enough, right? And so it's going to occur to most of the public that they were never, ever actually going to do this. And they're going to realize it all at the same time, all over the world, and they can't blame the other party because it's been going on for 20 years.
I mean, I think another element that's interesting here is, we're building, some new generation that tends to be the unreliable kind. And, the infrastructure we're coasting on to back it all up is aging rapidly, is being run in stop and go fashion that ages it even more quickly. I mean, I'm thinking of Australia here, where those coal plants are really end of life, but they've been leaning on them hard and actually doing, I guess, some refurbishment because of a realization that they're needed. That's my big worry is we're running on sort of the reliable stuff is legacy infrastructure that's not getting any investment for climate reasons, but also is just old.
Well, the era of history coming into the next 10 to 20 years could be described as play silly games, win stupid prizes. Dumbass decisions made have consequences down the track. And so far we've been able to get away with a lot of that by sheer the effectiveness of the existing system and the existing momentums. But if we're trying to build something fundamentally new, everyone's giving it lip service. It's called the green two-step. Sure, we'll do it later. Sure, we'll do it later. Sure, we'll.
And that's because the financial institution. I mean, partially, I guess, but that's because the financial institutions are not convinced yet. I mean, I guess they're a little more numerate, running the numbers and saying, not yet.
Yeah. Well, for example, they haven't made a refinery in the United States since the 70s because they haven't had the oil to process that. I don't know if that's still the case, but it was the case when I looked at this a couple of years ago. But if they can't justify the source, they're not going to finance the infrastructure. It's due diligence. So you've got the politician class are making promises, but to actually bring those promises to bear involves a lot of work and a lot of sacrifice by most of society at the same time, which is not politically correct to suggest. Right, then you've got the finance class that is not really convinced anyway, or they're waiting for someone else to take the risk. The conversation I heard at a battery capital investment group was the center of the European Central Bank gets up and says, right, okay, we want to do this. We want to invent a battery industry for Europe. Okay. And so, but then all the private sector banks said, well, okay, whoever steps in first will take all the risk and lose all the money. This is what Tesla is doing with Elon Musk. Make the market first, and now other groups are coming in behind him to actually take his market off him. Right, that's his risk. So, but then they said, look, the private sector won't move on the battery industry until there is a market for us to make money from. Everyone wants to be the third owner of the gym, where the market's already been developed and the risk is already developed, and they step in and they buy the product when it's ready to go and make capital. They don't have to do anything. They just sit there and collect money. Right, and so whoever moves first is going to get scalped by everyone else. So they're all looking at you, we're not going to move first. So then they collectively turn to the European Commission Central Bank and it says, right, you guys are telling us to do this. There is no market yet. So you will then go and make the market and we'll take it from you. Thank you. And the ECB goes, well, we can't do that because they just don't have the money for it, and then they're under pressure to behave responsibly. They're printing money behind the scenes, and if someone looked too hard, they'd be in a lot of trouble. Right. So European central banks the European Commission won't allow that. Sorry. And so everyone said, well, we can wait. And so everyone's like birds sitting on a fence watching each other. And that's why nothing's happened. So, and so they don't mind. There was a book by Naomi Klein that talked about disaster capitalism.
Yeah, the shock doctrine. Yeah.
Right. That's how these guys actually think. They don't care if there is misery, because that misery usually comes with money opportunities without rules. Right, and that's unfortunately how things are actually operating now. So anyway, if we're going to take out a coal-fired power station, which is available 92% of the time, coal's generally pretty reliable, right? We've got to replace it with many, 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 many solar stations that are smaller, right? But because of the weather constraints, solar radiation, they're only available 11% of the time. Now, that is based on the Energy Observatory, the Global Energy Observatory, that in 2018, what did each of these systems actually deliver? Not what they promised.
This is worldwide, not just Europe?
What did they actually deliver?
Worldwide capacity factor.
Worldwide.
Wow, that's low.
Yeah. So, and wind was about 24.9 because the wind doesn't blow all the time. And engineering has got to the point where that's up to around 33% now. But still, when you build these things, most of the time they're going to be standing idle, not producing power because of the restraints. So you've got to not only build lots that to replace capacity, you've now got to build out lots of dormant capacity for when the wind blows, and when the wind blows and the sun radiance is okay. And that's the information I was going to show you. So to replace our current fleet is 46,000 power stations, including fossil fuels. Right, and we need to bring in 607,000 new stations to replace the oil, gas, and coal systems for that reason. And so we're talking about a lot of capital investment, and a lot of it is going to be standing idle because you're at the mercy of the weather. And then you've got other problems. So back to the problems, we don't have enough time. We don't have enough capital. Even if we did have the time, that's a study for someone else, right? Then we get to the point, well, let's say we did the capital and the time, we don't have enough minerals in the ground to deliver. Now, the reason that's important, about 1% of the fleet is electric vehicles. So most of the ICE fleet vehicle fleet is still ICE. And renewable energy is still sitting around, say, 4 or 5% of the primary energy pie. So the non-fossil fuel system hasn't been manufactured yet. Constructed yet, and what's not constructed can't be recycled. And the sort of stuff that we want to use is comparatively exotic metals like lithium and cobalt to do it, or rare earths, right? And there's just not the metal in the system to recycle, and our mining is done in trace element quantities but we want to start mining it like steel. And the people who are suggesting this have no concept of what they're suggesting the mining industry must do if they're to deliver this.
So your critics are claiming that your calculations are off. And there's some alternative models which say, do we have enough minerals to power this clean energy transition? Yes. Will we blow through our 1.5 Celsius budget to produce these minerals? No worries. So why are these modeling studies clashing? What variables are being assumed that are different? Help me understand that.
So, okay, what I've done is instead of I've done something fundamentally different to everyone else. Most other studies will, for example, looked at if we were to expand existing capacity, and they'll use the past to predict the future, and they'll use very abstract things. And they'll use like calculations for that encompass whole systems. What I've done is said and they'll look at we'll replace 5% of the system at a time. Then I'm looking at full replacement of the existing system, which is some point in our future. So I've gone out and counted up the number of cars, trucks, commercial vans, buses, and all that. Then I went to trains, and then I went to maritime shipping, and then I went to aviation. Most other studies look at just passenger cars, and lately they're starting to look at trucks as well now. Right, and so that's
So you're
difference
taking
number
the net
one.
zero people at their word, and perhaps these other studies are being a little bit more limited, cautious, maybe even a bit more realistic about what we can actually change.
It's a straight calculation. It's a straight calculation. Question: let's see if you can. How many vehicles are there in the global transport fleet, in terms of cars and trucks?
I know I think it's in the billions, 2 billion.
It's actually 1.4
Okay.
billion as a conservative estimate, right? But now the World Economic Forum released a report in 2019 that put some numbers in there. When you actually extrapolate it out, they had 245 million. Right. So what's happened is the size of the transport fleet has been grossly misunderstood, or at least misquoted. Right. And so when they sort of say, "Oh, we'll need X amount of metal by this time," they haven't even got the number of cars right. Right. And then so what I've done is a straight engineering calculation. It's brutally simple. So there's no extrapolation. It's a case of we need 600,000 passenger cars. We need 162 million trucks, whatever the numbers were, but number of trucks, number of cars. And for each vehicle class, I got a commercially available representative. Like the Toyota Mirai, for example, is a electric vehicle. It's a medium-sized car, and we've got the stats for it. Like what performance does it do? Like how much power would it take to drive 100 kilometers? Right, that's known, that's stated. And so I've been able to actually sort of collect that kind of information. And the battery size is known. The battery chemistry is known. Right, and so you have a series of known things. And so you've got a representative for each class. And I've done that for the whole system. And then I've actually gone back and projected what did actually happen in 2018 in terms of power generation if we were to expand one sector and shut down another sector. So there's no extrapolation in that at all. Where things have gotten into a very grey area for me was the power buffer storage. Wind and solar are highly, highly intermittent. It's all over the place. Now, you've got our power system has to balance perfectly. Supply has to balance to demand to a scale of about a millionth of a second. Some very complicated engineering to actually get that to happen. It all happens in the background. We can't have a situation where supply goes up and down. Now, at the moment, the way we actually do this, in Europe in particular, is we trade power between the grids. Like each country, no country actually makes just enough power for what they need. They either make too much or too little. And they trade it amongst themselves to make sure everything balances out. So that's how things are done. And it's done balanced in particular with the gas industry. Gas is very flexible. It can go up and down, and it can actually meet things nicely. Now, wind and solar, according to, are used an IEA projection for the 2050 energy market, the energy mix. And then I added some of my own things to that. Now, in that mix, about 70% of the grid is wind and solar. Now, at the moment, wind and solar is quite small. And so when it varies, it's a simple matter of actually balancing it with another external power grid, usually gas. And that's how things are done at the moment. But when we actually move into such large systems, we're in an uncharted territory, and now we need to balance them ourselves. So the question is, how much power buffer will we need if wind and solar were to be completely self-sufficient, remembering there's such a large grid? Now, Net Zero America, when I actually sort of looked at the report and pulled it apart, in fact, the reason a couple of guys smeared me in print in Finland, in mainstream newspaper, and they said, "Look, this works rubbish. We've debunked it. It's not worth looking at." And they said some rather unkind things in print. And when we actually invited them in to talk to them, we finally got out of them that their belief, that they turned out to be capital investment guys. They weren't engineers. Their belief in what the buffer would be needed was based on what Net Zero America did. And they said 5 to 7 hours. I'm running on 28 days. They're suggesting 5 to 7 hours. And so that difference is the bulk of the raw material requirements. So what's happened here is a estimate of minerals needed is now become very dependent upon the outcomes of a relatively obscure engineering requirement. And that requirement hasn't really been looked at very effectively because we haven't needed to until now, right? So now in Net Zero America, they do a nice simulation. They have a series of scenarios, and they work out your power load is their demand and your power supply. And sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower. And they have 4 technologies to actually absorb when things are too high and then push it into when it's too low and it matches up. Right. So what they're doing there is they're looking at short-term variation only. Like their idea of long-term is they've only got to manage like a couple of days. So they'll hold a little bit of power and they'll move forward a couple of days later. Now, the other 3 technologies have their problems, but the thing is they're looking at short-term fluctuation only. They are not looking at long-term fluctuations. Now, long-term, the difference in solar radiation, so like how strong is the sun? The difference between winter and summer is pretty clear. In winter, we get less sun than in summer, right? That's a fair statement, and there's plenty of data to show that. And so a lot, like a lot different. And when it's so if it's got to be a stable system, right, and it's 6 months of the year, we're actually over the actual specification of what's possible. That power needs to be collected and stored for about 6, maybe 7 months. And then in the winter periods, when you're under specification, it has to be released slowly over the following 6 or 7 months.
I mean, this just seems so silly. Like, why even bother modeling it?
They haven't. This is the problem. This is actually the thing, though. The Net Zero America guys just didn't consider this. I mean,
the Net Zero America, I mean, to just really, really simplify it, at least as I've heard, Jesse Jenkins kind of summarize, who's, I think one of the lead authors on Net Zero America and one of the most prominent clean tech energy modelers, is that you sort of have 3 parts to your power generation system. One is the weather dependent stuff. Number 2 is the clean firm, which I guess is nuclear, geothermal, maybe hydro, although obviously seasonally intermittent. California is not relying on hydro right now as a clean, firm, baseload reliable source. And then fast burst, which I think is batteries kind of for voltage modulation. But what strikes me as the issue with this is that your clean, firm assets need to be able to meet 100% of demand. Because if the weather shits the bed, if we have a Dunkelflaute like in Germany, no wind, no sun, you need something to underpin peak demand. Now, I guess they're saying with a little bit of storage, you could get your clean firm down to a lower, you wouldn't have to meet all of your grid's demand. But that does seem like a rather monumental task. And as you're saying, if you have a continental-wide period of no sun, no wind, that's going to be a significant chunk of storage requirement.
Wind is the next problem, where we have these massive peaks and troughs, where you'll have for a couple of days, the wind will blow really hard and a lot of power is generated. And then you'll have like a couple of days where it's a lull, and it can change by as like 48% in some of these studies.
In a period of hours.
And so the size of yes. And so the size of these peaks then dictate how big a buffer you actually sort of need. And so the true number, I don't know. What I do think after looking at some of these studies in the paper that's sort of coming out, 28 days is not enough either. And the answer is we've got to change our requirements of why we need the buffer. So you remember wind and solar represents 70% of the global energy mix now. 70%.
Sorry, right now, or you mean in the future model?
No. In the future,
right, okay,
in the future,
okay.
Like the IEA prediction of the 2050 energy mix. That's where I took that from. And if we're not going to use wind and solar, what are our options? And that's an interesting question. And so something that is so volatile and vulnerable and changes all over the place to vulnerable to the weather, that's now 70% of our world energy mix, right? And if we got massive changes of seasons between winter and summer, 5 to 7 hours is not it's not for that purpose. It's just not going to work. So the net zero guys, look, I've undertaken a fairly complex study, so I do sympathise with this. You've got to have your hands on so many different variables, so many different sectors, and they just didn't consider it. Just wasn't part of their calculation, as were the minerals. That was a bridge too far.
And I mean, part of what strikes me, and I think we're going to abstract in a second and get just towards some of the foibles of modeling and the consequences and the way they're interpreted. But, I'm seeing a lot of very unrealistic modeling occurring, as close to home in Ontario, where we've got, some projections for 2050, which involve, about a third of our grid being hydrogen without really an acknowledgement that hydrogen needs to be produced as an energy carrier. And that kind of capacity level is insane. But in any case, I think it's because the model has to make net zero a reality. And, we have to bend the curve because, don't get me wrong. I think climate change is a potential catastrophe, certainly on a time scale of centuries. But, if you're facing an apocalyptic threat, the kind of psychological pressure on the modeler is like, well, we've got to make it fucking work. Or at least if the political imperatives are like, well, we're mandating that we're going to get to this level of emissions or net zero. It's incumbent upon the modeler to produce something for the politicians to show it's possible. In a way in which I think energy modeling, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, wasn't as imbued by these sort of psychological factors to create, frankly, really unrealistic outcomes.
Few things to say there. I've been in contact with a couple of groups now that do this sort of work. And I used to swear by these models, and I'll come to that in a second. They've all quietly told me, not all, but the ones that have actually spoken about this part have quietly told me that they're under considerable pressure not to say anything bad news like that might cost jobs, or that might suggest people will lose money, or anything other than we've got this under control and everything's fine. Right, and so anything. So I actually asked them directly, after showing them the data, that we've actually got a localized peak oil in November 2018. That's more complicated, by the way. Art Berman has recently done some very nice work to show where peak oil's at. Crude oil may well peak in November 2018, but total liquids is increasing because it's been supplanted by the gas industry. Right, and so anyway, so we're in this window now where we've got observations on the ground. It's no longer a theory. And so I asked them, guys, why didn't you talk about this? And they said, oh, we can't. And so there's this groupthink pressure not to go certain places. Now, when I did this first generation of work in, I think the first generation was developed but not published in 2018, and I depended on a lot of these models that are now quoting that everything's fine. And there are things like, what is the energy consumption of an electric vehicle battery? And a lot of it's based on old technology. And so the assumptions were badly wrong. But when I all put them together to do an engineering calculation, and then I got reviewed by a couple of guys in Toyota who actually produce electric vehicles, I got taken to the woodshed. And they said, look, your models, right, are badly wrong. And then they pulled up, this is what we are actually got on the market now, and these are the energy specifications. And they're badly wrong from what your model is suggesting. And so what I ended up doing in the next generation of work is taking out all such models and going to commercially available technology where the specifications are published, right? And it's a straight engineering calculation. It's not a model at all. It is literally a series of Excel tables summed together. There's no predictions or extrapolations or modeling in there, the only thing that's left of the original modeling is the energy return on energy invested stuff. But even that, there's a lot of screams of pain in the literature in the moment about people are flaming each other because they can't agree on what it should be done. And so now it's to the point where you make a point to show a graph, and then you leave it alone, and then it doesn't take part in any of the calculations from that point forward. So I've decoupled completely from the modeling world, right? And so which is, my methods are different, which means my answers are different, but you have to take them in the right context. You have to remember why this work was done in the first place. People are saying what you're suggesting is irrational. And so that's the point. The existing plan is irrational, and we should do something else. And that something else is interesting, but we've got to go and do it. At the moment, our best and brightest are tied up on things that I think aren't that useful.
Well, let's shift gears a little bit. To the implications of some mineral depletion. We've talked about that a little bit more, and what I think particularly interested in is our current mining is geared around our current energy system and current industrial system. And we're talking about very different types of minerals required for so-called clean tech technologies. And you mentioned taking rare earth minerals and trying to produce them on a scale like we do iron ore right now. I forget the niche minerals and turning them into whatever the equivalent is for steel. But let's talk about that a little bit. We hear a lot about rare earth mining, rare earth processing. What are some of the rare minerals, and how does their mining differ from the traditional steel, aluminum, etc.?
Rare earth elements are things like indium or yttrium. Germanium's not a rare earth, but neodymium, that's a rare earth. Yeah, okay, so the rare earths are things like neodymium, lanthanum, praseodymium, dysprosium, terbium, and hafnium. Right, and they're used in electronics. Like your iPhone, for example, will have a lot of rare earths in them. And so our technology has become very complex and requires these exotic materials. But then you can turn it around and say, do we actually need that technology to be so complex? Because it's whim-based, it's not function-based. If we went back to the good old-fashioned Nokia phone that was all the rage, 20 years ago, and I could make a phone call and send an SMS, that's all I need to do, right? And if you use 3D printing to make it, then how much of this stuff do we actually need? And so when you talk about what's demanded and what's needed. Now, so with these elements that a lot of the are in trace elements, if we're looking, a lot of them are what's called carrier minerals or byproducts. You don't mine indium, for example, directly. You mine zinc, and indium is often in the zinc concentrate, and you get it out as a byproduct. So what that means is indium production is entirely dependent on zinc production and zinc metal price. And when you're looking at a polymetallic process plant, which is a mineral processing plant that gets more than one element out, right? If you are optimizing to one element, you can do an efficient job. But the moment you start going for more than one, you've got layers of complexity, and you start losing efficiencies all over the place. Because you're trying to sort of pull levers and twiddle knobs to try and get the best, and things often break down. It becomes very complicated. So what we're getting is lithium production, for example. Lithium's the one that currently everyone wants to focus on lithium-ion chemistry, and one of the things I'm trying to get out from under, and said, like, let's not do that. Yeah, let's see what have we got. So in 2019. Where is it? The world mined 95,170 tons of lithium. And that sounds like a lot. And it's used for various applications. Now we actually want to mine to actually replace, using lithium-ion chemistry, what we have around us, where most of this, going to all sorts of different chemistries, we need 976,274,657 tons for the first generation. Now, that's the calculation at the end. Now, if we were to mine at 2019 rates, how many years will we need to hit that target? The answer is about 10,000. It's a little bit more than 10,000. Now, so then you say, just open more lithium mines. And so people will say, well, we can just pull lithium out of seawater. And so you can, but can you do it, effectively and viably? So the next thing to actually sort of look at is if we were to go to
and can't you just print more money to make it economically viable, right?
Yeah, well, yeah. That's like I said, the ideologies that we've actually been going with. If you were to sum resources, reserves, and resources under the sea, it is still less, considerably less than the amount of lithium we need for the first generation. And remember, everything wears out, and 20 years later or 10 years later, we do it all again somehow. And that puts pressure on the recycling side of things. So the current generation of work was to include what would happen if we included resources, and what would happen if we include undersea resources. And the answer is it's still not enough. And so there's lithium in the air. It's in the sea. Okay, but it's at such a low grade that the amount of capital investment you would need to get a unit of lithium is simply not worthwhile. And so you've got to have some sensible engineering
So
in there.
I guess the summary of how rare earth mining is different than traditional mining is that it's not necessarily the mining itself, because you're mining more common metals, but it's all in that processing, which I guess is China dominates at present. Is it dirty, nasty, environmentally harmful, or is it just the general tendency of Europe and the U.S. not to really like having mines? And
There's a few things in there. So China dominates the rare earth element production because they're prepared to do things that we won't. They don't have all the reserves, though. The rare earths are not necessarily that rare in terms of reserves in the ground. There are actually other places. The things that you would have to do, though, to process and extract those metals is not considered economically viable in countries like Europe or the United States. They go, no, too hard, let China do it. Because what they do to do it, they do stuff that we would consider illegal, not only in things like human resource management, but also in terms of they'll do things like use hydrofluoric acid to actually dissolve things, where hydrofluoric acid is a compound where if you even just a tiny little bit of it was to touch your skin, that's enough toxicity to kill you. But they'll have open lakes of hydrofluoric acid in their process plants. And yes, people die. And they're quite happy with that situation. Well, they're not, but the people on the ground certainly aren't. So the reason China dominates the world at the moment is that they're undertaking all the industrial jobs that are not very nice, that no one else wants to do, right? And that's why they've got all the production. So anyone around the world who's producing rare earth concentrate, they would sell that concentrate to a smelter in China, and away they go. And so usually rare earths are a byproduct of something else, and they come in a much smaller volume. So we actually want to now the existing internal combustion car at the moment uses mainly steel and aluminium, a bit of magnesium, and a bit of copper. And that's essentially it, right? But now we've got all these exotic metals like cobalt and nickel and and lithium, and all the rare earth elements that we want to run the electronics, right? And we want to now extrapolate that out as the foundational piece for our industrial civilization, the car. So now to the volumes involved, it says, and that oil system took a century to build, or more than a century to build, at a time when we had really, really good energy resources and easy capital. And mineral resources were relatively high grade and they were considered abundant. Now, none of that's true, right? And so now we've got a really fragile finance system that's not in a fit state to do industrial reform. We've got the largest human population we've ever seen. We're embedded in an environment that's deteriorating fast, right? And we're running out of energy too. And now we want to replace this whole system, peak oil. Now we want to replace that whole system with very fragile energy. Yeah, not so effective.
Okay, so one of the things that you hear claimed is that our existing mostly thermal sources, certainly of electricity generation, but I guess process heat and other things are thermodynamically inefficient. And a move to electrical engines means that you don't waste 50-60% of energy in waste heat. And the other thing you hear is that the existing fossil fuel industry results in a lot of mining, certainly coal. But I think when you think of hydrocarbons, liquid and gas hydrocarbons as a form of mining, won't that decrease enough so that the burdens of mining for these more exotic minerals are not too intensive? I mean, those are two things that are frequently brought up.
So conceptually, those statements are true, but you've got to put them in the right context. Right. So an internal combustion engine for, say, a passenger car is about 25% efficient. 75% of the energy is lost. An electric vehicle system at the moment is 73%, and it's getting better. Right. So what you do is you take a petrol car, work out the number of kilometers it drove in a year, right? And then if that car was an electric vehicle, how much energy would it require to drive that same kilometer distance? And that's what I've done. Right, so physical work done. And so I haven't actually considered the energy required in mining at all in any of my calculations. It's more the renewable technology requirements to run the system as it is. I've assumed that all the mining stuff just appears magically. Now, a phenomenal amount of energy is used to push the fossil fuel systems around. Like in the maritime shipping simulation that I actually looked at, the two classifications of oil and gas and coal to actually sort of move things around. I actually took them out of my calculations because we don't need them anymore, right? But it was a big chunk. And so, all right, you might say, well, you've got to put in a lot of infrastructure to drill for oil and extract out, and all right, and you might have to mine for coal. Coal happens to be one of the most efficient mining methods we have. When you get into the metalliferous stuff, it's much, much more capital intensive because you've got to crush and grind it and then float it, whereas coal, you stick it up.
You
and
just put it
use
in a conveyor belt, ship it straight to
the
power plant and burn it there, essentially. Turn it into dust and burn it.
You've got to put it through a coal wash plant, which involves things like removing ash. So there are a few processing steps, but they're nowhere near as onerous as, to say, grinding a gold deposit to, say, 20 micron. And the idea that so first of all, if you go from ICE to EV, yes, we do have a massive efficiency gain, right? So that's embedded in the calculations. All right, now we've got 1.4 billion vehicles travel, a little under 16 trillion kilometers in a year. Go. How much energy do you need to service that? So this is the chain reaction that is set off. Also, now we've got to include the rail industry. Some of it's electric, some of it's not. So any diesel locomotive now gets replaced with another locomotive. I looked at an electric powered with a battery bank, and I looked at a hydrogen fuel cell system. And the hydrogen fuel cell was considered more sensible because you actually had, instead of like a massive battery bank that weighed like a massive amount, the hydrogen fuel cell was much smaller in size, so it could go for a longer range. And there are assumptions like that in there. Are they economic? Well, it's not that sort of thing. It was a much cruder calculation. When I'm saying all short range vehicles are electric vehicles and all long ranges are hydrogen, that's not sensible in terms of economic market, but it does provide a rough cut in terms of, for the global system at large, how much materials will we need. And I couldn't find anything that came close to that, which is why I did it. And so for the second question is, if we actually stop mining fossil fuels, the mining of fossil fuels is a tiny, tiny fraction of the rest of mining. And so if we're to go green, so, if I often say, if the environmental movement doesn't join hands with the mining industry, their green transition will not happen, right? Because you need to mine a bog load of lithium now and cobalt and nickel, get on with it. And so what that means is they're going from an air war, stop the carbon, to a land war, strip mine the planet, right? Both are going to be disastrous. And so taking coal out of the system is a very small amount of the mining involved, and the energy you lose in doing so is not really replaceable with the sheer volume of it that we can do it.
And of course, those fossil fuels, or a certain amount of fossil fuels, need to be burned in order to fuel mining. We talked. You gave the example last episode of, and it was very nice. It was a pretty detailed description, very efficient, of an open pit coal mine, and basically how preposterous that was to fully electrify. I mean, this is run by like a 300 megawatt gas plant powering the crushers and the bucket excavator, but the rest of the stuff covered by diesel, simply not viable to be replaced. There, some listeners pushed back and said there are some mines which are already basically electrified. I think those are more kind of underground mines. Is that a tiny fraction of existing mining that's basically mostly electrified, or is it niche?
No, what they've got is no. You've got to unpack this. Most the actions on a mine site are electric, right? So your power plant is electric, but to run that electricity, your mine's off in the middle of nowhere, and so you've got a gas-fired power plant, and a pipeline of gas will go out to it, or coal, whatever it is, and powers that power plant, and that power plant powers everything else. Things like your drag lines are on the end of an extension cord. So there's a lot of stuff that's already electric, especially underground stuff. Where we get into trouble is the truck and shovel fleet, right? And so these big trucks, you've got a diesel generator that generates electricity, and that electricity is then run to use electric motors at the wheels. And that's how they run at the moment. And so it is true that a lot of mining is already electric, but the parts that are not electric, how are you going to replace that? So at the moment, they've got the idea of the electric battery truck.
Or like overhead cables for certain sections to decrease the size of the battery.
So now let's consider that electric truck. Like you've got there's lots of videos of them racing up and down, and they've got the speed. Can they actually run for the same time? Like a diesel-fueled truck can run for, I think it's 14 hours before it needs to fuel up. And so one shift comes in, then refuels, and the next one comes out. How long can that battery-powered vehicle run for before it needs recharging? And then how long does it need to recharge? Now, this is important because a mining operation is designed around its equipment, right? How many trucks and shovels it will need will depend on their capability. Like what's their load time? What's their travel time? What downtime do they need in terms of maintenance? Now we've got downtime for charging. So those numbers I've not seen, but I'm very skeptical.
And we went into a fair amount of detail in the last episode on this, so we'll refer people back to that. In the few minutes we have left, I just wanted to we've addressed kind of the rare earth elements to some degree, but polysilicon is obviously a huge part of the puzzle in terms of solar production. It's in the news because China is contemplating a solar wafer technology export ban. But briefly, I mean, I've heard aluminum, a very intensive mineral, described as solid electricity simply because of how much electricity is needed. I've heard polysilicon's maybe even worse in that regard. Can you tell me a little bit about polysilicon production, mining?
Before I do that, I pulled up an old example that I used. So we've got this is all shifted with a diesel fuel truck in Bingham, in Escondida, which is a mine in South America. In Escondida, it's a copper mine. About a third of the total energy consumed is in the haulage of the ore from the pit floor to the pilot plant. The haul road is so long. So if you've got a 255-ton capacity in this truck, right, and we're going to take away the trucks and we're going to bring in donkeys. Donkeys are now going to take the ore from the pit floor up to the van. It was a joke. But how many donkeys do you need to replace? How many? If Bingham Canyon, they cut 5,000 tons of rock for a 10 ton an hour of copper. And so to do that, you'd need 66,000 donkey loads an hour.
Wow.
Right.
And, I mean, and this is kind of...
So you can't...
This is the kind of thing that could almost be, I mean, again, what's being described is not quite as ludicrous as this, but I mean, this is, I think, what your modeling is doing. You're not trying to say that this is, I think certain modelers are modeling in such a fashion to make it possible, and you're sort of taking a good, honest stroke at modeling what folks are saying is possible. And again,
boundary conditions.
Right.
I'm showing a hard boundary condition, and I'm proposing, instead of saying it's not possible, I'm saying we need a better plan. Do something else. And that something else is entirely possible.
We're going to have to get into that in a subsequent episode. And in the time we have left, just humor me by giving a little polysilicon overview.
So silicon, solar panels are made from silicon, and silicon is the most abundant element on planet Earth. But you need very pure silicon, what's called metallurgical grade silicon. Not just any silicon will do, because the more impurities you have, the more damage you're doing to your smelter in actually getting rid of those impurities. And so they have what's called metallurgical grade silicon. So we take that and we heat it to 2,200 degrees Celsius to make a silicon wafer. At the moment, this is done mostly in China, and they use coking coal to develop that heat. And this is missing entirely from my study. The heat needed to actually manufacture goods. Okay, we've got steel in there, but there's none of the other materials are in there. So to make a silicon wafer, you've got an enormous amount of energy to heat the material and then purify it and then go to the next step. I've got the numbers, but I don't have them to hand at the moment. But at the moment, we use coking coal to do that. Now, you can use an electric arc furnace to do that, or you can use biofuels, or you can use hydrogen. But each of those options have their problems, especially when you consider how much of those options will be needed to expand by to replace what we use coking coal for now. Now I'm talking quantity. How much coking coal is used and the calorific energy in that coal is now replaced with, say, biofuel or hydrogen. And you're going to make that hydrogen and then transport and store it and all the rest of it. So the whole lot of the manufactured technologies that we've got to phase out fossil fuels are intimately dependent on fossil fuels to produce them and get them into place at the moment. Now, I'm not saying it's not possible. What I am saying is the engineering process flowchart to make something entirely without fossil fuels from one end to the other doesn't exist yet. And a lot of that thinking just hasn't been done.
And perhaps it could be done as a tiny pilot project. But again, I mean, when we're talking about scalability, it seems almost as preposterous as the donkey example.
Well, a lot of the on the donkey example assumed 200 kilograms on each donkey. Well, that's a big donkey. So, so the studies have been done to put the numbers together in a thumbnail sketch that show how silicon wafers are actually made. But I haven't actually seen anything that scales up to the volumes needed. And in fact, that's on my list of things to do when I get around to it. Because what does fossil fuels actually do for us? We're pretty good with oil, but gas and coal, we have no clue.
Well, I think we're going to have to park it there. There's so much more I'd like to explore with you. I've come to, I think, the sad realization that fossil fuels are just too good. Our entire industrial civilization has been built around them. They are a pretty unique, well, I guess an entirely unique form of energy in many of their applications. And I just, I'm kind of chuckling to myself at the idea of, using biofuels, for instance, for polysilicon production, because we're also apparently relying on them for things like bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, to make our net zero curve fit the model. When taken in sum, what we need to rely on to replace fossil fuels, it just seems preposterous. But that's my gestalt, and I don't think it's the public gestalt. I'm not sure if it's your gestalt, but
No, it's not. I was one of these guys shouting from the rooftops, "We're doomed. Here's proof." Right, but now I've come to the conclusion that there are solutions. The solutions aren't for everyone because people won't look at it, right? But if we change, so we're talking about the supply end of the equation. If we change the demand end of the equation by being smart, change the paradigm, change the ideology, change what we're trying to do, right? All sorts of solutions start falling out, and it requires all problems are put on the table at the same time with all solutions at the same time, and every stakeholder has to sit around that table and have a frank discussion of what's possible and what's needed. And if we cut away the bullshit, we actually have some things we can approach and do. Very simple things like make batteries out of something else other than lithium. Wow! So or develop an electrical engineering technology that can manage variable power that doesn't need a power buffer. Something that can cope with a very varying current, varying voltage, varying frequency. If you can do that, and then we can make it applicable, then we don't necessarily need a large buffer, if one at all. And if that's the case, a lot of those material requirements scale back. Right. So the solutions are there, but we've got to look in the right direction. And that's what I'm trying to communicate to people.
Certainly going to demand a significant decrease in demand and significant degrowth, it sounds like, to make this work. And I mean, is there enough fat in the system to be trimmed that won't actually impact on, some of the gains of the Industrial Revolution, like, massive drops in childhood mortality, increase in lifespans, et cetera? I think that's kind of an open question.
That's a very complex question because we live like kings now compared to people, say, 1,000 years ago. The average person lives really well. And we've become very complacent and very dependent on our technology.
I'm not eager to go back, as Hans Rosling puts it, to die in harmony with nature. When the average woman had 6 kids and only 2 survived, and that's how we maintained a stable population.
But hang on, we've got to look at the gains we do have. We now have education and knowledge of science and engineering unlike anything that's been seen before. If we were to apply that to these problems with new limitations, innovation changes. Like, what would happen if we made things out of hemp and bamboo? Instead, what would happen if we scale back the need for mobile phones and we developed a very primitive Nokia phone similar? Like, we scale back what we needed. And the average human being evolved in capability to not be so dependent on technology anymore, and so on and so forth. There are solutions there.
I guess there's the argument that, a reliance on biological organisms on things like bamboo simply results in more land conversion, and in some sense, just as coal saved, what's left of European forests, a reversal means a return to a greater use of the so-called natural fuels or natural materials. Plastics save a lot of what is it? There's a certain kind of turtle that used to be used for horn rim glasses. I think the hornbilled turtle.
So you can make plastics out of bioplastics, and so on. But can we harvest that much more out of the environment sustainably? No. So now we have to make cutbacks.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's leave it there. I mean, daunting problems we face. Thank you for shining a light on them. I hope it brings some reality to the discussion, to the decision makers. But definitely quite a sobering analysis. So thanks again for coming on, Simon, to shed a light.
You're welcome. So the future is actually work will be done. And after we get through the hard part, we do have something to contribute.
Question is, will that work be done by donkeys, and can they actually carry 200 kilograms? I literally used to work pack horses. We put pretty heavy loads of moose meat on, big Belgian and Percheron horses. I think 200 kilos on a donkey is going to break its back, to be honest, but maybe a mule.
Yeah, especially if you do 66,000 runs an hour.
Oh my God. All right. We'll leave it there. Thank you, my friend.
Right, no problem.